On the day the fate of planet Earth came down to a single spoonful of chili, nobody in that research base expected an alien doctor's wounded pride to decide humanity's future. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight, and let us step into the moment that changed everything. The Kalan conquered ship had been sitting quietly above the Nevada desert for 11 days before anyone on Earth was allowed to speak with its crew face to face. Colonel Jake Harmon still remembered the first time the ship's shadow crossed over Fort Ridgeline, a mile-long silver shape gliding without a single sound, like the sky itself had grown a scar. Nobody panicked, nobody fired a shot. Word had come down from Washington fast and clear. The Kalan were not invaders. They were observers, sent from a wider alliance of worlds to decide, quietly and carefully, whether Earth deserved a place at their table, or whether it should simply be left alone and forgotten. Undefended, on the edge of hostile space. That decision, Harmon had been told, rested almost entirely on the shoulders of one alien. His name was Dr. Reith Kalmori, a Kalan physician assigned to study human biology, human behavior, and human resilience before filing a formal report to his Concord's ruling council. Reith stood just under 7 feet tall, with pale gray skin that shimmered faintly under artificial light, 3 narrow eyes set in a triangle across his face, and a voice that carried a strange, musical calm no matter what he said. He had studied 400 species across the galaxy. He was, by every account Harmon had read, brilliant, meticulous, and utterly convinced that humans were the most fragile species he had ever examined. "Your species bruises if a chair is pushed too hard against your leg," Reith had said during their first formal meeting, not unkindly, simply stating what he believed to be fact. "Your skin tears from friction. Your internal organs shift position if you fall from a height less than 2 of your meters. I have documented 11 species weaker than yours. I have documented none that believe themselves stronger than they are." Harmon had let that comment sit in the room for a long moment before answering. "Doctor, with respect, you've been here 11 days. You've run scans, blood work, and reflex tests on maybe a dozen soldiers standing at attention in a lab. That's not the same as knowing us." Reith had tilted his head, an expression Harmon had learned meant polite disagreement. "Data is data, Colonel. I do not need to watch a species suffer to understand its limits." That line had stuck with Harmon all week, mostly because it was wrong in a way he couldn't yet prove. The base itself, a joint research and defense outpost built into the hills outside a small Texas town, had become the temporary home for the Kalan delegation, while their council decided Earth's classification. Lieutenant Sarah Whitmore, the base's science liaison, had spent nearly every waking hour translating Reith's reports, smoothing over cultural misunderstandings, and quietly worrying that his conclusions were going to get the whole planet marked as not worth protecting. She had pulled Harmon aside 2 nights earlier with a warning that still echoed in his head. "There's a second Kalan ship out past the asteroid belt," she'd said, voice low even though they were alone in the briefing room. "Not Concord, Skarn raiders. They scout worlds the Concord hasn't formally protected yet. If Reith files a report saying Earth is fragile and not worth defending, the Concord walks away, and the Skarn move in within weeks. We are not talking about a diplomatic insult here, Colonel. We are talking about whether anyone comes running if things go wrong." Harmon hadn't slept much since. Down in the mess hall that same afternoon, none of that weighed on Sergeant Mike Dawson's mind, mostly because nobody had briefed the cook on interstellar politics. Dawson ran the kitchen like a small kingdom, and he took enormous, almost religious pride in one dish in particular, a chili he had been perfecting since his second deployment. Made with 3 kinds of pepper, he grew himself in pots behind the mess hall. Soldiers who ate it for the first time either cried, laughed, or went suspiciously silent for several minutes. Dawson considered all 3 reactions a compliment. Dr. Reith had wandered into the mess hall that afternoon for what he called a nutritional observation, clipboard in hand, 3 eyes scanning trays of food like a man studying rock samples. He stopped at Dawson's station, peered into the simmering pot, and asked in that same calm, faintly superior tone, why humans would deliberately consume a substance their own bodies registered as a threat. "Your species has sensors in the mouth," Reith said, "designed specifically to warn against tissue damage from heat and chemical irritation. Your medical records show elevated heart rate, sweating, and mild inflammation after consuming what you call spicy food. And yet you seek it out, repeatedly, willingly. For pleasure." He said the word pleasure the way a man might say the word malfunction. Dawson wiped his hands on his apron and grinned the grin of a man who had been waiting 11 days for exactly this conversation. "Doc, you've been running tests on us for a week and a half. You want to understand humans? Understanding starts with a bowl." Reith's third eye narrowed slightly, the closest thing he had to raising an eyebrow. "I do not require discomfort to gather data, Sergeant." "No," Dawson said, already reaching for a bowl and a ladle. "But I think you're about to want to." Behind them, Whitmore had just walked in, catching the tail end of the conversation. And something in her stomach dropped the way it does right before a car goes over a bump too fast. She knew Dawson's chili. She knew Reith's ego. And she had a growing feeling that whatever happened in the next 5 minutes was about to matter a lot more than anyone in that room realized. Whitmore crossed the mess hall fast enough that her boots squeaked against the tile, but she was already too late to stop Dawson from setting the bowl down in front of the alien doctor. Steam curled up off the surface, dark red and thick, with flecks of pepper still visible like tiny warning signs nobody was reading. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "maybe we ease into this. Dr. Reith's physiology hasn't been fully mapped against capsaicin sensitivity. We don't actually know how his nervous system will." "With respect, Lieutenant," Reith interrupted, not unkindly, "I have already run a full biochemical analysis of the dish's compounds while the sergeant was speaking. Capsaicin, a chemical that binds to pain receptors and tricks the nervous system into registering heat that is not present. A curiosity at best. Your species eats this for enjoyment the way some primitive Earth cultures once believed pain proved courage. I find it, frankly, an inefficient use of a nervous system." Dawson leaned against the counter, arms crossed, grin steady. "That's a lot of words for a guy who hasn't tasted it yet." Something shifted in Reith's expression, subtle, almost human in its stubbornness. Whitmore had spent 11 days learning to read those 3 narrow eyes, and what she saw now looked uncomfortably close to pride refusing to back down. She had seen that look on colonels before a bad decision. She had seen it on her own brother right before he broke his arm trying to prove a swimming pool wasn't that deep. "Doctor," she tried again, softer this time, "you don't have to prove anything here. Nobody's grading you." "I am aware of that, Lieutenant," Reith said, and picked up the spoon anyway. The mess hall had gone quiet in the way rooms do right before something either very funny or very bad happens. A few off-duty soldiers had drifted closer, phones already half raised out of habit before Harmon's standing order about no recording around the delegation made most of them lower again, reluctantly. Dawson didn't move. Whitmore didn't breathe. Reith dipped the spoon in, lifted a modest, almost clinical portion, and ate it the way a scientist samples a controlled substance, with total confidence that his own data had already told him everything he needed to know. For nearly 4 full seconds, nothing happened. Then his third eye widened. What followed was not, by any stretch, a medical emergency, but it was, by every account later given in the mess hall, the loudest anyone had ever heard an alien speak. Reith set the spoon down with exaggerated care, as if it had personally betrayed him, and said something in his own language that the base's translation unit rendered, a beat late. As a phrase closest in meaning to, "This substance is attacking me." Dawson burst out laughing so hard he had to grab the counter. 2 soldiers by the far table lost it entirely. Whitmore, despite every diplomatic instinct in her body, felt her mouth twitch dangerously toward a smile she was absolutely not allowed to have right now. "Water," Reith said, with the calm precision of a man refusing to admit defeat even while his whole face had gone a shade of gray-blue nobody had documented before. "Not for the sensation. For the compound, it is a chemistry problem, nothing more." "Milk works better," Dawson offered, already sliding a glass across the counter, still grinning. "Capsaicin's fat-soluble, not water-soluble. Water just spreads it around." Reith stared at the glass like it had personally insulted his research method, then drank it anyway in one long. Undignified gulp that did absolutely nothing to hide the fact that his eyes were watering, all three of them at once. It was in that exact moment, with the alien doctor gripping the edge of the counter and breathing like he'd just sprinted a mile, that Colonel Harmon walked into the mess hall, drawn by the noise, and stopped dead in the doorway. "What," Harmon said slowly, "is happening here?" Nobody answered right away, mostly because nobody trusted themselves not to laugh. It was Reith, still catching his breath, who spoke first. "Colonel, I appear to have miscalculated a biochemical response." Harmon looked at the bowl, then at Dawson, then at Whitmore's carefully neutral face, and something clicked into place behind his eyes. The kind of instinct that had kept him alive through 2 decades of service. This wasn't just an embarrassing lunch. This was the first time in 11 days he had seen Dr. Reith's careful, clinical calm actually crack. And cracks, Harmon knew, were where the truth usually leaked out. By that evening, the story had already spread through Fort Ridgeline faster than any official memo ever could. Soldiers who hadn't even been in the mess hall were telling versions where Reith had turned 3 different colors, or where he demanded a full medical evacuation over a bowl of chili. Harmon let it run. Morale had been low for 11 days under the weight of quiet observation and unspoken judgment, and this was the first thing that had made his people laugh in almost 2 weeks. What worried him more was the conversation waiting for him in the briefing room that night. Reith sat stiffly across the table, 3 eyes fixed somewhere just past Harmon's shoulder, still visibly recalibrating something about his own worldview. Whitmore sat beside the colonel, tablet in hand, watching the doctor with the careful attention of someone trying to read a language she'd only just started learning. "I would like to revise a section of my preliminary report," Reith said finally. Harmon leaned back. "Which section?" "The section concerning human pain tolerance and voluntary discomfort." Reith's fingers moved slightly against the table's edge. A gesture Whitmore had come to associate with genuine discomfort rather than performance. "My species does not choose pain. We avoid it with total efficiency." It did not occur to me that a species might choose it deliberately, repeatedly, as entertainment, and call it enjoyment and mean it. "You looked pretty convinced it wasn't enjoyable," Harmon said. "Not unkindly." "I was in error," Reith said simply. "The sergeant's dish caused genuine physiological distress. My heart rate increased by 40%, my tear ducts activated involuntarily. And yet, when the sensation faded, I found myself experiencing something I can only describe as satisfaction. As though I had proven something to myself that mattered more than the discomfort cost me." Whitmore glanced at Harmon, and for the first time all week, she let herself hope. "That's called grit, Doctor," Harmon said. "We don't have a fancy word for it, we just call it grit. Most of us learn it early. Sports, boot camp, a bad breakup, doesn't matter. You get knocked down, it hurts, and you decide the hurting isn't the whole story." Reith was quiet for a long moment. "My initial report classified your species as biologically inefficient, prone to unnecessary suffering. I was prepared to recommend Earth for what my Concord calls passive classification, meaning observed but not defended. Not worth the resource allocation." The room went very still. "And now," Harmon asked, keeping his voice level even as his pulse picked up. "Now I am uncertain," Reith admitted. "A species that seeks out-controlled suffering for the satisfaction of overcoming it is not a species I have encountered before. It suggests a resilience that does not show up cleanly in a blood panel." He paused. "I would like more data before I finalize anything." Harmon didn't get the chance to answer, because that was the moment the base alarm cut through the building, sharp and insistent, followed almost immediately by Whitmore's radio, crackling to life with a voice that made every hair on Harmon's arm stand up. "Colonel, this is Watch Command. We have contact, repeat contact. Unidentified craft entering atmosphere bearing 210 descending fast. It's not Concord's signature." "Sir, this matches the Scarn profile from the briefing 3 days ago." Harmon was on his feet before the transmission finished. Reith rose too, 3 eyes suddenly sharp and alert in a way Harmon hadn't seen from him yet, all traces of the mess hall entirely gone. "They monitor Concord communications," Reith said quickly, urgency replacing his usual measured calm. "If they intercepted any part of my preliminary report, the passive classification section, they will believe Earth is undefended. unprotected. An easy target. How many ships? Harmon said, already moving toward the door. Scouting parties are typically small, 3, perhaps 4 vessels, enough to test your defenses. Enough to decide whether a larger force follows. Reith's voice had lost every trace of scientific detachment. Colonel, if they land and find your soldiers weak, disorganized, unprepared, they will report Earth as easy conquest. What happens in the next hour will decide far more than my report ever could. Whitmore was already sprinting for the command center, shouting for base-wide lockdown, and Harmon fell in beside Reith. Both of them moving fast down the corridor, as the alarm kept wailing overhead. Dr. Harmon said, voice tight, "You wanted more data. Looks like you're about to get it up close." The Skarn ships came down hard and fast, 3 angular black hulls cutting through the evening sky over the Texas hills. Engines screaming loud enough to rattle windows 2 miles away. Harmon reached the command center just as the first vessel touched down half a mile past the perimeter fence, kicking up a wall of dust that rolled over the outer watchtowers like a slow brown wave. "Talk to me," Harmon barked, pulling on his gear as soldiers scrambled into position around him. "Confirmed Skarn configuration," the watch officer said, eyes locked on the display. 3 landing craft, 12 to 15 hostiles per ship based on thermal signatures. They're not hiding, sir. They're walking straight up the access road like they own it. Reith stood near the doorway, 3 eyes fixed on the readouts with an intensity Harmon hadn't seen from him before. "That confirms it," he said quietly. "They believe this base is undefended, passive. If they encounter organized resistance, real resistance, they will reconsider everything they think they know about your species." "Then let's make sure they reconsider," Harmon said. "And key the base-wide channel. All units, defensive posture, bravo. Nobody fires first, but nobody backs off either. Sergeant Dawson, I want that kitchen locked down and your people armed and ready at the secondary line. Down at the outer perimeter." Corporal Ryan Cole crouched behind a concrete barrier with his rifle steady against his shoulder, watching the dust settle around the first wave of Skarn raiders as they advanced. They were tall, lean, covered in dark chitinous plating that caught the last of the evening light, moving with the loose, confident stride of soldiers who had done this exact walk on a dozen other worlds and never once been surprised. "They're not even using cover," Cole muttered to the soldier beside him. "They really think this is going to be that easy." It almost was for about 90 seconds. The first exchange came fast and violent, plasma fire lighting up the dusk as the Skarn advance line opened up on the outer watchtower without warning. Confident that whatever resistance followed would break immediately. It didn't. Harmon's people had spent 2 decades fighting in places that taught them how to hold a line under fire, and they held this one, falling back in disciplined stages, covering each other, forcing the Skarn to pay for every yard of ground instead of walking through it. Reith watched the tactical display from the command center with something close to disbelief. "They are retreating in formation," he said, almost to himself. "Controlled withdrawal, not panic. That is not the behavior of a species I classified as biologically inefficient." "Doctor," Harmon said, not taking his eyes off the display. "We've had a lot of practice." The real trouble started when the second Skarn craft deployed something bigger, a heavy walker unit that rolled through the perimeter fence like it was made of paper. Its cannon already tracking toward the secondary defensive line, where Dawson's makeshift kitchen unit had dug in alongside regular infantry. Harmon watched the range numbers drop and felt his stomach tighten. "That thing punches through our line. They're inside the base in under 3 minutes, the watch officer said. "Options," Harmon snapped. "Cole's squad has anti-armor charges at the fuel depot, but that's 400 yards from the walker's current path, and closing that gap under fire is." "Send them," Harmon said. Now, Cole heard the order come through his earpiece and didn't hesitate, already moving, already shouting for his squad to follow. Cutting across open ground, toward the depot, while plasma fire chewed up the dirt behind them. Beside him, a younger soldier stumbled, and Cole grabbed his vest without breaking stride, hauling him back onto his feet and forward. Because stopping wasn't an option anyone in that squad had ever been trained to consider. Back in the command center, Reith's three eyes tracked the movement on the display with an expression Whitmore had never seen on him before. Something between alarm and pure, undivided attention. "Colonel," Reith said, voice tight, "that Walker unit carries a secondary weapon system designed specifically to counter infantry charges. If your soldiers reach the depot in time to arm those charges, they will be directly in its kill radius when it fires." Harmon's jaw tightened. "Then we better make sure it never gets the chance." Cole's squad hit the fuel depot with the Walker unit 40 yards out and closing. Its heavy cannon already rotating toward the exact position they needed to reach. There was no time for a clean plan. There was only time to move. "Charges on the support struts now," Cole shouted, already sliding behind a stack of supply crates as plasma fire tore through the air above his head. Two soldiers broke left, slapping anti-armor charges against the Walker's rear leg joints, while a third laid down covering fire from a low ridge, forcing the machine's targeting system to hesitate for the half-second that mattered most. Inside the command center, Harmon watched the feed with his hands braced flat against the console. Every instinct in his body screaming at the distance between his people and that Walker's kill radius. Beside him, Reith had gone completely still, three eyes locked on the display, and for the first time since he'd arrived on Earth. The doctor looked less like a scientist studying a specimen, and more like a man watching a decision that mattered happen in real time. "They are inside the danger zone," Reith said quietly. "If that weapon fires before the charges detonate—" "They know that, Doctor," Harmon said. "They're doing it anyway." The Walker's cannon finished its rotation and fired a fraction of a second before the charges went off, a blinding flash that lit up the whole ridge. And for 3 full seconds, nobody in the command center breathed. Then the smoke cleared, and Cole's voice crackled over the radio, rough and breathless but very much alive. "Walker's down. Repeat, Walker is down. Squad took some hits, but everybody's still standing." "We are not done here." Something in the room loosened just slightly, just enough for Harmon to remember how to exhale. With the Walker gone, the tide on the perimeter shifted fast. The Skarn advance, built entirely around the assumption that Earth's defenders would break under pressure the way Reith's early data had predicted, began to falter against soldiers who simply refused to stop fighting even when the numbers said they should. Dawson, of all people, ended up dragging a wounded infantryman back behind the line under direct fire, still wearing his kitchen apron under his combat vest, muttering something about how nobody got to die on his watch after surviving his chili. Reith watched all of it, every piece of it, the retreat that wasn't panic, the charge that wasn't recklessness, the sergeant who left a burning kitchen to save a stranger. And something in his careful, clinical understanding of humanity finally, completely rearranged itself. "Colonel," he said, voice quieter now, almost reverent, "I need to transmit an updated report to my Concord immediately, before the Skarn withdraw and report their own findings." "Make it good, Doctor," Harmon said. "Because if they leave here thinking we're weak, they'll be back with a fleet instead of a scouting party." Reith moved to the communications terminal himself, hands steady despite everything happening around him, and began speaking in his own language, fast and precise, feeding real-time footage of the battle directly into his report. Whitmore, watching over his shoulder, caught only fragments through the translation unit, but the fragments she caught made her chest tighten with something like hope. Words like exceptional resilience, words like voluntary sacrifice for others, words like recommend full protective classification, immediate priority. Outside, the Skarn advance broke apart entirely under a final coordinated push from Harmon's remaining defenders, the surviving raiders retreating back toward their 2 remaining ships in a hurried, disorganized scramble that looked nothing like the confident march they'd started with. Within minutes, both craft lifted off, engines screaming as they climbed back into the darkening sky and vanished, leaving behind scorched earth, a burned-out Walker, and a base full of exhausted soldiers who were, against every early prediction, still standing. Harmon stepped outside as the last Skarn engine faded into silence, dust still settling around the perimeter fence, and found Reith standing beside him a moment later. 3 eyes fixed on the empty sky where the ships had disappeared. "They will report this engagement to whoever sent them," Reith said quietly, They will not recommend a full invasion, not against defenders who fight like this. And your report? Harmon asked. Already transmitted, Reith said, in full. Including the part about the chili. Despite everything, despite the smoke and the wounded and the exhaustion sitting heavy in every muscle of his body, Harmon actually laughed. 3 days later, the Kaelan Concord's response arrived, relayed through Reith's terminal in a transmission that took nearly 6 minutes to fully decode. Harmon stood in the command center with Whitmore on one side and Reith on the other, watching the doctor's 3 eyes move rapidly across text none of them could read, waiting. Well, Harmon finally asked, unable to stand the silence any longer. Reith turned to face him, and for the first time since his arrival, his expression held something unmistakably close to satisfaction. Earth has been granted full protective classification within the Kaelan Concord, effective immediately. A defensive escort will be assigned to monitor this system going forward. Any future incursion by Skarn forces or any hostile party will be met with a Concord response. The room let out a breath it had been holding for 11 days. I want to be honest with you, Colonel, Reith continued. My original assessment of your species was built entirely on clinical data, heart rates, tissue density, reflex speed. By every number I collected, humanity should have folded the moment real pressure arrived. Numbers said you were fragile. Numbers said you would break. Numbers don't know us very well, Harmon said. No, Reith agreed. They do not. It took a bowl of what your sergeant calls chili to show me that pain, for your species, is not something to be avoided at all costs. It is something you choose to walk into, deliberately, sometimes for pleasure, sometimes for pride, and sometimes, as I watched 3 days ago, for each other. That is not inefficiency, Colonel. I understand that now. That is strength wearing a disguise my instruments were never built to measure. Later that evening, the mess hall was louder than Harmon had heard it in weeks. Soldiers trading exaggerated versions of the battle, Cole's squad getting slapped on the back by half the base, and in the middle of it all, Sergeant Dawson stood behind his counter with a fresh pot simmering, grinning like a man who'd just been personally vindicated by an alien government. Reith approached the counter slowly, 3 eyes fixed on the pot with an expression that was almost nervous. One more bowl, Doctor? Dawson asked, already reaching for a ladle. A smaller portion, Reith said carefully. Purely for the purpose of continued research. Dawson laughed and served it up anyway, and this time when Reith took his first bite, he didn't reach for the milk right away. He sat with it a moment, 3 eyes watering, breath a little unsteady, and something that looked remarkably like a smile crossing a face that wasn't built for smiling. Well, Whitmore asked from across the table, unable to hide her own grin. Uncomfortable, Reith admitted. And against every instinct my species has ever developed, entirely worth it. Outside, past the fence line, past the scorched earth already being cleared and rebuilt. The sky over Fort Ridgeline stayed quiet and dark, and for the first time in 11 days, genuinely safe. Somewhere far beyond that sky, a report was already circulating through Concord Command, one that would eventually be studied by other species, considering whether Earth was worth watching closely. It would go down in Concord history, not as a report about pain tolerance, or reflexes, or blood pressure. It would go down as the report that started with a bowl of chili, and ended with an entire species being taken seriously for the very first time. Colonel Harmon never did get a straight answer out of Reith about whether the second bowl was really for science. He didn't need one. Some things he was learning didn't need a clean explanation. Sometimes a person, or an alien with 3 eyes and a stubborn streak, just needed to choose the hard thing once, feel it burn, and come out the other side glad they did. If this story hit you right, do not scroll past without hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories just like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me which line hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that strength doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.